So what is the NM sign of Monteggia fracture dislocation and double L sign of Galeazzi fracture dislocation? In Monteggia fracture dislocation, we have ulnar shaft fracture, ulnar shaft fracture with proximal radial dislocation. However, in Galeazzi fracture dislocation, there is radial shaft fracture with distal radio ulnar joint dislocation. So let's start. These are examples of Galeazzi fracture. These are examples of Monteggia fracture dislocation. This is the N sign and M sign. N sign, there is ulnar shaft fracture with displaced fragments. This is an important part because we have ulnar shaft fracture without displaced fragments, and this is not Monteggia fracture dislocation. Okay, so the displaced fragment is a part of the fracture dislocation. Why? Because these displaced fragments will dislocate the radial head. Okay, so this is very important. Okay, in the process of fracture dislocation. Okay, so here M sign is proximal radial head dislocation. Okay, again, Monteggia fracture dislocation, there is ulnar, okay, ulnar shaft fracture with displaced fragments leads to proximal radial dislocation. Okay, again, Monteggia fracture dislocation. Okay, there is ulnar shaft fracture with displaced fragments, and these displaced fragments will lead to proximal radial dislocation. Okay, so how do I know that the radial head is dislocated? Yes, there is, you have on the lateral X-ray of the elbow joint, we have anterior humeral line and radio capitellar line and the radio capitellar line. Okay, so what is the anterior humeral line? And if you draw a line on the anterior aspect of the humerus, okay, it should intersect the anterior 1/3 and the posterior 2/3 of the capitellum. However, if you draw a line along the axis of the radius, okay, it should intersect the middle part of the capitellum. This is the radiocapitellar line. So if you try here to draw the radiocapitellar line, yes, it doesn't intersect the capitellum. The radiocapitellar line doesn't intersect the capitellum, indicating that this radius is displaced anteriorly. Okay, again here, okay, if you draw a line here, it won't, intersect the capitellum, so this radius is displaced anteriorly. Okay, the other fracture is Galeazzi fracture dislocation. Again, double D sign of Galeazzi fracture dislocation. There is radial shaft fracture. There is radial shaft fracture, okay, with displaced fragments, and the displaced fragment of the fracture is very important in the process of the dislocation of the radial. Okay, so sorry, there is radial shaft fracture with displaced fragments. Okay, the other D is distal radio-ulnar joint dislocation. This distal radio-ulnar joint dislocation. Okay, so the displaced fragment here of the radial shaft fracture will lead to distal radio-ulnar joint dislocation. Okay, so can you see the dislocation here? There is widening of the radio-ulnar joint. Okay, again here the double D sign of Galeazzi fracture dislocation. The first D is radial shaft fracture. Okay, with dislocation of the distal, the other D is distal radio-ulnar joint dislocation. Okay, again, the bone that is in direct contact with the carpal bones is the radius. Okay, is the radius on lateral X-ray. So this is radial shaft fracture with displaced fragments. Here's the displaced fragment. These displaced fragments will lead to dislocation of the distal radio-ulnar joint. Okay. So here's the displaced ulna. Okay. So I think I will try to show you something. Yeah. Why I'm telling you that the fracture dislocation, these two fracture dislocation needs displaced fragments, because here, as you can see, this is ulnar shaft fracture without displaced fragments. So without displaced fragments, so there is no rupture dislocation. You can say that this is ulnar shaft fracture only. There is no fracture dislocation. Okay, this is it. So this is not Monteggia fracture dislocation. Okay, again here, as you can see, this is the ulna. This is ulnar shaft fracture without displaced fragments. That's why there is no dislocation. Okay. Again here, this is the ulnar shaft fracture without displaced fragments. So this is only fractures. This is not fracture dislocation. This is not fracture. There is no dislocation of the proximal radius or radial head. Okay, so this is only ulnar shaft fracture. Again here, there is ulnar shaft fracture. There is no dislocation of the proximal radial head. That's why you need to say N ulnar أو N M sign M proximal radius. Okay. Yeah, again here, this is ulnar shaft fracture. Okay, this is the ulna here. This is the cranium of the ulnar shaft fracture. There is no dislocation of the proximal radius. Okay, that's why I tell you N in ulnar, M proximal radius. Yeah, there is no dislocation of the proximal radius, so this is not fracture dislocation. This is only fracture. Left ulnar shaft fracture. So that's it, and thank you.